I'm Dr Bryce Dyer for SUPboarder, and this month we're going to be tackling the question of team tactics in SUP racing. Is it possible? Would it work? Is it controversial? If you think back to September this year, the 11 Cities race, which for those who don't know is a multiple stage race in Europe, on stage one, Bruno Hasselhoff won the first stage by 20 minutes, which effectively then wiped out the race for everyone else for the rest of the week. There was no way they were going to come back and try and overturn that kind of gap. But if they had applied a team strategy, or if a brand had applied a team-based approach, is it possible that that gap could have been overturned later in the race through different tactics and different strategy? And this isn't unusual in sport. We have cycling. Team tactics is inherently part of its character. You have a designated leader or leaders, and there's a much larger team of riders behind them that help that leader to succeed and do well. Even in running, which is inherently an individual sport, when Kipchoge broke the 2-hour barrier for a marathon at the beginning of October, he utilised a team of 41 pacemakers and a team and fleet of motorcycles that fed him nutrition. So sometimes the collective group can actually improve the result of the individual. But would that work in SUP? Well, there's the thing, and the problem you've got is fundamentally is one of incentive. Why would a series of paddlers be willing to give up their own individual results for the good of the whole? And that is going to make it tricky, because SUP is a new sport and a small sport, and it's very, very hard when there are relatively few races in a season, relatively few paddlers, to convince them to devote their energies to someone else to achieve a bigger result is going to be quite hard to do, at least as the sport currently stands. With that in mind though, is it actually possible? And if it was possible, how would we implement it? Well, it obviously lends itself really to distance-based racing or endurance-based racing. It's very hard to control the dynamics in a race like a technical race or a beach race where there's lots going on, there's lots of turns, the pace is quite erratic, and weather conditions and environmental conditions can have sometimes a much greater effect on the outcome. So realistically, if we were going to apply it, we'd want to do it to a distance race. We want to do an endurance-based event. And what I'll do now is I'll go through a series of different scenarios and explain to you how I would implement it, and possibly how you could actually roll it out in the future and try it potentially for yourselves. Okay, so I'm now going to go through a series of different scenarios, which I'm comically going to use a series of bath ducks here on our fictitious start line and our watery environment. If you think first about what happens at the start of a typical event, you have a relatively chaotic situation of paddlers behind the line in a variety of positions. The start gun goes, and all the paddlers surge forwards. Now, what you normally get is what initially goes from quite a chaotic environment into where arrowheads begin to form. And what you'll find is that as stronger paddlers come to the fore, other paddlers fall in behind, but it's not necessarily organised, it's just really forms this kind of arrowhead formation. Over time, as the strongest paddlers come to the fore, these arrowheads can often converge together, become a mass or a pack, but ultimately they'll typically become one of a long thin line, a draft train. You'll have the stronger paddler at the front taking his turn, other paddlers sit behind that, sheltering from either wind, elements, or generally just reducing the hydrodynamic drag they're producing because they're slipstreaming the paddlers in front. So the people down towards the rear are getting a much easier ride than the person is at the front. Right, let's take that scenario and actually try and apply some team tactics to it. Now, one of the scenarios I would suggest they could do is to have what I would call a lead out. And in this particular case, imagine our team, which is made up of 4 paddlers, in this case all marked with black tails. Rather than just the relative chaos at the start, what will happen is they'll surge forward on the line in a train straight from the start. And of course everyone else is heading out into their various arrowhead formations, etc., etc. But rather than staying just as a line, the first 1 or 2 paddlers will actually put in an incredibly high intensity effort, ultimately sheltering the intended team leader, who in this case we're going to say is going to be a man 3. These 2 paddlers will do a high intensity burn, probably about 3 to 5 minutes in length. In this case, they'll be at their upper limits of what we know as VO2 max, their best effort production of around 3 to 5 minutes. At the end of that, they'll be exhausted One paddler will pull off, the other paddlers will continue to charge through as they move away from the line, and then eventually the next paddler lead out will be exhausted, he'll pull off, leading our true leader. Now you may ask, if he's the leader, what's this paddler here doing then? Now let's imagine for a moment that our two exhausted paddlers have faded away. The rest of the pack have realised this is the stronger area. They've moved to move in behind as they would do conventionally, forming trains and arrowheads, for example. Now this is where it gets quite cute, because this paddler here is going to be our disruptor. He's our sweeper. Rather than necessarily actually following the guy in front, what he's actually going to do after a while is he's actually going to begin to slow down and increase the gap as our paddler in front then pulls away. He'll hold the others back. By this point, the time it will take to get from this paddler when they realise that something is wrong onto the tail of the lead paddler is going to require quite a large amount of effort. It might only look like a short distance, but that may well be 30 to 60 seconds worth of effort to come round, accelerate after he's realised that that's what's happening, and get on the tail of the paddler in front. And there's a good chance that's not going to happen. By this point, this paddler is heading off and away over the horizon while everyone else is working out what to do next. So that is the lead out strategy. Okay, let's try another scenario where team tactics might work quite well. Now let's try and think about mid-race now rather than at the start of the race. This is basically using a team to chase a leader down. And this applies very, very well to the Bruno Hasselhoff situation at the 11 Cities. If the other paddlers have realised that he was going, they could work together as a team to bring this paddler back. Now, in typical racing, that does actually already happen to a certain extent, but realistically, it's a marriage of convenience because the paddlers aren't in the same team, and eventually they're going to become suspicious of each other and stop working because they're trying to save their energy for their sprint effort later in the race. However, if we actually use an aligned team, so we've got 4 paddlers from the same club or team or sponsor, etc., and we have our lone paddler out here in front, all that will happen is, a bit like the start lead out example I mentioned, is that we now have a controlled burn, and that will be done in one of 2 ways. Either we can have the lead out structure again, where one takes a turn and then he's basically discarded and the others come through, or we can have what's known as a pace line. In that particular case, that's whereby a paddler does a short duration effort they can recover from. Now, I would argue that's probably going to be 1 minute to 2 minutes in length. They've then got to pull off. The other 2 members of the team will come up. That person will then slot in a gap that falls behind them and the designated team leader at the rear, and they'll then go through this process, each taking short burns, short turns to close the gap down to our paddler in front. Because they're getting recovery periodically and getting shielded from the elements in front as they do so, that means that they're working at a higher intensity and faster as a collective whole than the one paddler probably is doing out in front. Given time, as they all take their turn, they will then get closer until eventually they'll get in there and tack on the back of the person they have just caught, thereby shutting the gap down. And this is used all the time in cycling. A series of teammates work together, and it's called through and off. It's a little different in SUP racing purely because of the density of water. The key thing to bear in mind here is, unlike running and cycling where they're moving through a fluid as air, there's a difference. Water is probably around, I think it's 764 times, I think, or somewhere between 750 and 800 times more dense than air is. As a result, when you make moves to accelerate, it takes a lot longer to respond. So, it takes considerably longer. So it's not like a runner, when someone comes past, you can quickly respond. Everything requires much more time and much more thought. There's another method here that we could use. It's one I would call the working over. And this is whereby you'll have a series of paddlers working together. And in this case, we've got our one solitary paddler who is from a rival team or a rival individual that these paddlers in front want to make sure doesn't beat them to line. So what they do is they send a series of what I would call attacks up the way. That'll be whereby this one goes off on his own. This paddler now has a choice. He can either stay with the ones that he's in, or knowing full well they're in a team, he could go after the one that has already gone and put the effort in. And maybe he'll be successful, maybe he'll get onto the tail. When that happens, this paddler here will slow down, attach, allow the rest of his team to tack back on, and at that point another paddler will go. When that happens, of course, this paddler is now trying to go away, he gets on the back, and then maybe they'll be successful, but if they're not, the paddler in front will stop again, allow his team to catch up, and another team paddler will then attack, and they'll keep attacking until the paddler that's on his own is so tired, effectively in the end he gets ejected off the rear of the pack entirely, or he's left with the remains as the leader goes free. So that's what's called working over someone. Okay, in this we've now looked at scenarios at the start and scenarios in the middle of a race. Let's look at the finish at the end. If in the chance that you're still in part of a group as the race nears its conclusion, team tactics again can be very, very useful at overcoming other individuals. Now in this scenario, we've got our finish line and we have our group coming into the line made up of 3 paddlers from the same team and 2 separate individuals. This is where you can replicate the cycling model of having what's known as a lead out. It's a bit different to what I showed at the start of this, but it's whereby a series of paddlers again lead the eventual winner into the line. It's used for sprinters. SUP's different. Like I've already mentioned about the water density issue, everything takes a lot longer to react to and do in SUP than it does in sports like running and cycling. So whereas a cycling lead out might only occur in the last minute to 2 minutes of a race, in a SUP event, even the ability to begin a sprint and overcome someone in front of you could take a couple of minutes on its own to get past one paddler. So if you're going to get past several paddlers, that can take quite a lot of time. With the slow burn lead out like I'm suggesting, what you'd have is your group would begin to chop and change. The dominant team would then nominate their leader, who at this point could be the second or the third person again. Again, we could be using our disruptor at the back, a sweeper, to actually drop back and hold these people back, or even actually in slightly more aggressive circumstances to act as a block, and that'd be whereby this paddler could come up the outside, this paddler could then effectively change their line, taking some of the paddlers away from people coming into the line, making them paddle the extra distance, or just disrupting whatever the tactics are going on behind. But in this case, we could actually have it whereby you've got your 3 paddlers coming as a lead out, they then put in their hard burn again, do a turn, pull off, come forward, do a turn, pull off, and then the eventual winner comes into the line. But actually, that's not always going to be possible, and like I say, we're talking in terms of minutes here, not seconds. So this kind of strategy, although I've shown it here close to the finish line, could take 10, 15, 20 minutes to implement properly, just to try and get rid of, we can shed these 2 remaining paddlers. But it is possible, and it does show the benefit of where you have multiple paddlers all working together. Okay, so I've shown you a few different scenarios now of how you can employ team paddlers. A couple of things to think about. The first thing is really, how would you recruit paddlers for a team like this? Well, ultimately, it might make sense at a glance to recruit the strongest paddlers that you can find, but actually what you really want to do is recruit the right paddlers with the right unique skill sets you need for a variety of the scenarios that I've shown you. So it isn't just a question of getting the fittest paddler. It might be, for example, if you want to recruit paddlers for a lead out, or paddlers that can attack, or paddlers that are going to sacrifice themselves after a shorter period of time than the race lasts, you recruit paddlers who are good at that kind of work, and get them to train accordingly. If you want someone that's there purely to act as a disruptor and purely to set a really high pace at the start of the race, and that is their job for the event and their job only, then you recruit people who are known for that or good at that, or you get paddlers to train with that unique scenario in mind. And as a result, they'll have all the optimal skills needed to create that scenario, and then obviously you have different members of your team, all with different skills to employ and different training backgrounds. I guess that brings us to the last point really about whether this is actually really a good idea for SUP. I mean, SUP as it stands is an individual sport, everyone has an equal chance on a relatively level playing field. If you start allowing teams in there, that's going to change the dynamic of a lot of races. It's likely, or it's going to be very difficult for an individual to overcome the force of a number of paddlers working cohesively together and working against them. And with that in mind, maybe something for you to think about, and put your thoughts in the comments box below, really what you think about the introduction of teams would be like. Would it change the dynamic? Would it make races more interesting, less interesting? if we look at other sports, it's never really happened in running, although we do utilise pacemakers to a certain extent, but in cycling it's bread and butter of the sport. So have a think about what you think, whether it be a good idea or not, and it's an interesting thing to try out in races about working with your club mates and teammates together to see how you can change the results and the dynamics of the races that you compete in.